He once sold flowers online. Today, he's an MIT professor building AI to help us find common ground. Meet Michiel Bakker on this episode of Kendall On Air. Oh, Michiel. Make sure I pronounce your name. Michiel?
Michiel.
Michiel.
Yeah, we can start with that. Just practice.
Okay. So for the fifth time, Michiel. Right, Michiel. What a wonderful name. So what does your name mean?
I don't know. It's just the same set of names: Michael, Michael, Michel.
So it's a biblical name, probably.
It is
right?
a biblical name.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You're probably one of the saints. Saints of AI, maybe, right? But Michiel, it's definitely a pleasure to have you here on Kendall On Air. And I've met a lot of MIT professors doing remarkable things, right? But I think you might be one of the most interesting, or a person with one of the most eclectic backgrounds. I know you dabble a little bit even with quantum computing at one point, and then you were in Yangon, Myanmar, doing a real estate business, and then also selling flowers, right, in London. So you do have a spectrum of life and profession that you've kind of lived. But tell me a little bit about yourself and how you actually came all the way here to MIT to really explore AI as a means to bring social harmony in some ways.
Yeah, so I think it was mostly, I guess, an accidental path rather than very deliberate. But I did physics undergrad in Delft in the Netherlands, and then I did mostly quantum computing, and sort of with that quantum computing background and the publications I had in quantum computing, I then applied for PhD programs at MIT. But sort of in the meantime, during my master's and a bit after my master's, I did spend a year in Yangon building a sort of Zillow Trulia, I think is the other one in the US, real estate platform buyer meets seller through some German investment firm called Rocket Internet. I must say that was a very different, that was not really that it helped me, even though it was super interesting, and I still love Myanmar, and I'm in touch with a lot of people now in Yangon, and I still care about the country. It's not that was really a requirement to then go back into research. It was sort of a separate path. But then I spent a year in Yangon building this real estate startup, and I spent a year in London building a flower sort of delivery subscription startup, and then ended up doing my PhD at MIT, computer science, spent 4 years at DeepMind, one of the AI companies, and then now I'm back at MIT since a year ago. Almost a year ago, 7, 8 months.
Yeah, right.
Since last summer.
So, it's really, really hard to land a job at MIT from what I know. So you must be like a genius or something, because you were, in some ways, were you a little distracted, right, with e-commerce businesses, right?
Well, but it's also a long time ago. So yeah, maybe, I think it's not, people should not, if they want to be a professor at MIT, they should not start an e-commerce business. So I don't think it helps at all. It's more that I got there, I guess, despite the real estate business rather than because. And I think I also got very lucky. I think a lot with professorships and jobs in general is about being at the right time in the right place. And I think after sort of the ChatGPT moment took over the world, I think the people who were working on these language models, which included me at the time, also were in a very fortunate position where the whole world, including universities, were looking to hire people that sort of had that expertise.
Sure.
And so I think that made it easier to get back to MIT in this role.
Right. So I just want to know, what were you kind of like as a child, always kind of curious? Or were you mesmerized by computers?
Yeah, so I don't know. I think growing up in the Netherlands is also very different than here. So what I understand from friends here that have kids is that from an early age, you feel a lot of pressure to make sure your kids do the right extracurriculars, that they go to the right high schools, that they get good grades. Well, I think the cool thing about the Netherlands is that it's in some ways allows much more sort of failure. So I did primary school, high school, I was never really one of the top students per se. I had okay grades, but I was also very distracted by things outside of school. And I don't know, smoking weed and skipping class, and so I think it wasn't that I only studied and had 25 extracurriculars and was doing volunteering works in the weekend to get to university. But because of the Dutch system, if you do well enough, you can go to universities, and it's less of an elite system where you have to have exceptional grades to get into the best programs. All programs at all universities are reasonably good, and so it matters if you can get into one of those programs. And getting into one of those programs, as long as you're sort of in the right level of high school, it's a whole complicated system that I think the Netherlands and Germany have. But as long as you're in that level of high school, which are just public schools, so accessible to everyone, you can go to university. And so I think it's much easier to be distracted in the Netherlands and do other things, and then at some point wake up and say, oh, I want to be ambitious and go to the US and do a PhD. And then maybe when you're 21, 22, start working very hard, get good grades to do your PhD in the US. Well, I feel in the US, if you grow up, you constantly have to be on top of your game. To then eventually get into, I don't know, a good college and a good PhD program. So I'm very happy that I grew up in the Netherlands, and I'm not sure if I would have been able to get here if I grew up in the US.
But then what motivated you to apply to a school here in the US? And a PhD program even, right?
Yeah, so during my undergrad, I wasn't so ambitious or committed yet. And then towards the end of my bachelor's degree, I did physics undergrad. And I started with a lot of what people call classical physics, so Newtonian physics. And then at some point I got quantum physics, I think in my second year. And that was the first time where I had a perfect grade for any subject. And I really, really enjoyed it. And so I was like, studying can be fun, coursework can be fun, exams can be fun. And so that's when I got more ambitious, at the time specifically related to quantum physics courses, so not so ambitious in my other courses. But then for my master's, I was like, I should really try to get good grades such that then after I could, I don't know, do things for which you require good grades, which include doing a PhD. I wasn't so set on the PhD yet. And then during my master's, I did more and more research projects and coursework, and I really liked the research. And that's when I decided to apply for PhD programs.
And what are you currently working on right now as a researcher and a professor?
Yeah, so I have sort of two areas that I'm interested in. One is AI for collective decision making. So if you have a group of people, the group of people has different ideas or opinions or goals, whether that's small, so deciding where we go for dinner tonight, or very big, so think about democratic decision making. If you have different people with different goals, how can you bring those people to one collective decision, right? So one example is a project I did where we asked people for their opinions on the topic, and then we use language models to generate consensus statements that are likely to maximize some notion of agreement among those group of people that share their opinions. So that's one example of a project. And then the other thing I care a lot about is sort of AI safety generally and AI alignment. So how do you align these large-scale AI systems with preferences or goals that people may have? And specifically, how do you do this if the goals and preferences of those people differ? So those preferences are heterogeneous rather than sort of monolithic.
Yeah, and in this like ever so polarized world, so to speak, I think what you're doing is really kind of very meaningful, right? To really foster AI safety, and then also to bring harmony in many ways, right? And I think I read in some interview that you did actually that with this tool or function, sometimes people come to you asking for like almost like a marriage counseling, right?
We did
AI,
have after
right?
this project, we did have some,
a relationship conflict management AI.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious, like humans can kind of read the room and just read the energy of the other person, right? So how does AI navigate that complexity and delicate topics?
Yeah, so maybe two separate things. I shouldn't oversell our research. So the research we did to date is looking at people share their opinions. Their opinions is a paragraph of text. And then we try to find some statement that people likely will agree with, and then they can critique that statement. And we sort of have a process of getting to a consensus statement where people agree with. Like, it's not that AI sort of has privileged access to people's ideas or brains or data in some kind of way that a human mediator doesn't have. So our project specifically argues that human mediation, like a couples therapist or like a mediator in a professional setting, can help bring people to agreement. But mediation is also hard to scale, is very expensive. In like most settings where we have, for example, a group chat at work or a WhatsApp conversation among friends, there is no human mediator that is sort of neutral and helps us find agreement or explore ideas. So the cool thing with AI is that in theory, if you have good AI mediators and if they can be trusted and they fairly represent different people in the group, then these AI mediators are much easier to scale and to put in many more sort of group conversations and WhatsApp chats, and maybe make our sort of collective communication and decision making better in some ways. Not because they are per se much better than human mediators, but just because it's much easier to deploy AI systems and have AI mediators than human mediators. So I don't know if AI, at least the current AI models, can read the room much better. Maybe over time, we will get there where, I don't know, they're better at understanding people's emotions, or I don't know, understanding is maybe anthropomorphizing them too much, but maybe predicting people's emotions.
Right, with maybe enough data or things that they've seen, right? Yeah. And I guess that's where my next question comes in, which is basically AI is working with data, right? So I'm just wondering if, minorities' point of view or their values are a little diluted by the bigger data, which is majority's opinion, right? Like how do you kind of navigate that with the research?
Yeah, so this I think is a very important question, and especially if you think about governments or policymakers, which might sound as science fiction now, but maybe a policymaker will ask feedback on a draft policy document from an AI system, or even ask the AI system to make the first draft. It is very important that this AI system understands sort of the goals of different people in society, whether they belong to some majority group or a minority group. So one thing that I think is super important is evaluating this capability. Like, do AI systems understand different points of views so now these new AI systems, these sort of thinking models that first give a sort of chain of thought before they give an answer. One of the interesting things is that now in that thinking process, we can sort of detect how they get to their decision, or at least we could reason about that and try to analyze that thinking text, those thinking tokens, those thinking steps. And so there we can see, how do they get to the decision, and do they actually take different people's preferences into account? So I think it's super, like maybe the short answer is, I think it's very important to think about this, to evaluate this, and to make sure that these AI systems take people's opinions into account fairly when making decisions.
And I know that this field is still fairly like early and nascent, right? And of course, AI is also maturing. It's kind of growing and also, I think, developing its own kind of systems very rapidly as we speak even. But how do we know that these systems or what we're seeing, AI facilitating is something that we can trust? Like, where's that transparency in the picture?
Yeah, so this is very hard because transparency, ultimately, these are huge black box models that make decisions somewhere inside its parameters, and it's unclear exactly how they make these decisions. I think one way to answer that question is that these new sort of thinking models, so OpenAI has them, DeepMind has them, Anthropic has them, that these thinking models show their thinking process more explicitly before they commit to a final answer. So that's one way to sort of answer that in a more generalizable way. The other way, specifically about the project that we did, is that the mechanism by which we get to a collective decision is by first generating loads of different proposals for consensus statements, and then we rank those consensus statements given people's opinions. So we say, given your opinion, how would you rank those different candidate statements? And then if we have all those rankings, we aggregate them and find the final statement. And the nice thing about that is that it happens largely outside of the model, and therefore people can actually inspect it and can say, well, is this actually how I would have ranked those candidate statements? So you could, for example, think of ways to do this in a decentralized way, where you have everyone contribute some sort of drafts, right? If we're collectively deciding where to go for dinner tonight, everyone contributes some proposals for restaurants. We all take those proposals for the restaurants. We all have our own AIs ranking them. And then we commit the rankings back to some central node, and there we aggregate the rankings and have the final decision. And because this happens mostly outside these models, it's much more interpretable and transparent.
See, how scalable do you think this research is in real world context when maybe the controls are not under control as much as in a research setting per se?
Yeah, so I have one recent project I did where we work with the Alliance for Middle East Peace on supporting a real world peace process with sort of AI technologies. I think there it's super important that we don't put too much value on the sort of AI decisions or the AI statements or policy proposals. So there what we did is that you have human mediators that come up with collective statements in this peace process, and then we have a number of sort of human mediation proposals, and we have a number of AI proposals, and then we ask people to compare and vote on all these proposals. So there it's much more that we complement some human mediation process than replace some human mediation process. So I think we have to be very careful on how we integrate these technologies into the real world, because these technologies are imperfect and they have benefits like being much more scalable. But also downsides. For example, if they're fine-tuned or trained to do one thing or in one domain and you use them in some other domain, that could create risks.
So would you be able to elaborate on some of the concrete risks, or is that something that you would...
Yeah, so there are many sort of general risks like overtrust. You could imagine that if we have some AI agent that represents us and that tries to represent us in some collective decision-making process, that we give more and more power to this AI agent, and we sort of more and more lose the capability to reason critically about these decisions ourselves, right? So that would be one risk, that we put too much trust into these systems. The other is that you sort of don't know the training data that goes into this system. So often it's sort of opaque how they're trained exactly. They're maybe trained by private companies, or they are open source, but that then means that the weights are open, but maybe not the training data. So that creates risks around trust and transparency.
So I think with the pace that AI is moving, all of these things are kind of unfolding itself in the future is inevitable. But how do people, like human beings, prep for this kind of future? Education is probably very important, right? But what do I do?
Yeah, so this is the big question. What do you do to prepare for this future? I think one thing that is important is to sort of embrace these technologies in your professional life. So work with AI, try to incorporate them into how you do your job. Ultimately, these technologies will impact how we do our jobs in almost any profession. So really exploring where the capabilities are, what are ways you could use it, I think could help make people more resilient to this change. But yeah, I definitely don't deny that this will have a lot of impact, both positive and negative, on people's jobs, on the labor market, on...
So you mentioned the positives and the negatives, but what are you personally most afraid of in terms of the advent of technology and AI, and what are you most excited about?
Yeah, so I think what I'm most afraid of are a few things. One is that this technology is progressing very, very rapidly. And I think now, because we have largely low unemployment rate, if people lose their jobs because of AI, this goes mostly unnoticed because people find another job quite quickly. But we might get to a point where this is no longer the case, right? And where people will actually lose their jobs and have a really hard time finding a new job. And at this point in time, we might see some friction or chaos around this, where people feel that AI is really taking over different parts of the economy. And so I think this could lead to a lot of societal disruption, where we might not trust, like maybe our perspective on AI will change. We might not trust the system anymore. We might not trust each other anymore. We might not trust the government anymore. So I think this societal disruption is something that could be very consequential and could change the world quite drastically and quite rapidly. The other thing is that these technologies are very good at doing science and doing reasoning and doing coding. And these are all dual-use technologies. If you're very good at biology, you're very good at creating better medicine, but also at maybe creating biological weapons. So if you have a technology that is very good at biology in general, this could create both benefits, but also very clear risk if it falls in the wrong hands. And now most of these AI technologies currently are behind APIs, where these companies fine-tune them to not help with hacking or making biological weapons. But the more and more these technologies are out in the open and we have open source models, the easier it will be for people that want to do bad with this technology to access them and maybe hack into, I don't know, some hospital computers or make some biological weapon. So I think large-scale misuse is something that I see as a big risk for society.
Yeah, for example, if it falls under the North Korean regime, right, and they have incredible hackers, I hear, like that are like just sweeping crypto, trading platforms like left and right. So if it falls under their hands, and I'm South Korean, so this feels very like like a sensitive topic to me, but it does pose a very imminent and very real threat.
Yeah,
right?
definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
and now a lot of these models are open weights, so anyone in the world can download these models and run them and fine-tune them. And so even when the company or the organization that makes the model fine-tunes it to not help with hacking or with cybersecurity attacks, it's very easy for especially a nation state to take this model and fine-tune it to do something differently, right? To actually be useful for hacking.
So, I mean, I think your research is really very enlightening, and it's very like future-oriented, really, towards the right path. So, how's your research being funded, and have you seen some effect? Because in the news headlines we hear about all these research funding being cut, so on and so forth.
So I think generally in academia, it is becoming harder to apply for government funding. I think there are people in more the biohealth domain that have a harder time than computer scientists, but I think generally it's getting harder to get research funding. I think there are some foundations, there is some philanthropic funding. If you have listeners that want to support this research, they're always welcome to reach out. But generally, I think it's getting harder to do research in general.
And what kind of impact will that have?
I think that there are different ways to fund research, like people, you can fund a PhD student that then can do work on these kind of topics. There is a lot of work you can do either more on the theory method side, like the paper I was talking about, or more on the impact side, trying to use this technology to make social technical systems better, make social media better. I also work a bit on community notes, for example, which is a feature on X that helps with fact-checking. So it's a crowdsourced fact-checking tool. So sort of research in that direction is very directly impacting the health of our social media. So I think maybe people think about research as this sort of very futuristic, long-term, this might impact society in 20 or 30 years, but there is a lot of research also that impacts society directly.
Like right now, today, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I have just two additional questions, and one is kind of coming from my selfishness, I suppose, because I'm raising a little child, a little human being, and I think all parents are quite honestly worried about the future because it's moving so fast and it's going to be so different from what we're used to, right? So what kind of profession would exist with the advent of AI and might be a thriving profession in the future? And I know this is a pretty open-ended and hard question, but what are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
I think this is a very hard question, right? There are, it's a very difficult question. I think generally if you're a strong communicator and have technical skills, or if you are entrepreneurially but also have some deep technical expertise, I think like having those type of profiles where you have some expertise but you're also a generalist, such that whenever, for example, if you're a very good software engineer but all software engineering gets automated by AI, you can quickly switch to some other field or other direction. I think that's very important. And then I think it's also very important to have sort of the conversation at a societal level that if there will be unemployment and if it will be harder for people to find jobs, what will we do about that? How are we going to think about distribution of wealth and opportunities in a world where there are maybe less jobs or
policy level.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
But that's like, I guess you're on a like family, if you have to think about what will kids do in the future, that doesn't really help, perhaps.
Right. I mean, I guess within the internal family policy-making department, we can think about those things, but certainly it's not.
I don't know if you're the head of policy in your family, but then you can definitely.
But how to deploy resources, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think it even comes down to like your personal wealth kind of strategies too, sometimes.
Yeah, but for someone that joins the labor market in 10 or 15 years, it's incredibly hard to predict what to do and what's the best way to enter that labor market, and whether you should now do a 4-year undergrad degree, for example, or not, or whether you should do a master's degree or maybe some like online course and try to switch faster. It's very difficult to predict how the labor market
And even
will
like, what
evolve.
do you learn now? Like, do you learn coding, or do you want to be in quantum? Like all that stuff.
I think coding is a good example because I would say if you now start learning coding, and especially if you start a 4-year CS degree, I think it's unlikely that at the end of that 4-year CS degree, people will still be coding in the way that they're coding now, right? There might be a few people still coding that like optimize some small part of a distributed system, for example. But it's not that in 4 years we'll still have full stack engineers everywhere that are making websites. But still, I think coding is a good example because coding also helps you with thinking about problems in an engineering way and like how to build different components and how to think in a logical way such that whatever you want to do, you can explain it to a computer. So I think coding is a skill which might not be directly relevant anymore, but is relevant because it helps with sort of critical thinking and engineering skills.
It's like the foundation. Per se.
Yeah.
My last question is like, Michiel, you strike me as an incredibly creative person, right? And I'm just wondering, like, are you just kind of born that way, or is there like a discipline that's applied, like a practice that you do, or like you have to be very intentional about it? Like, what kind of brings your superpower?
I don't know if I'm so creative. I think what helps me is that I'm a very social person, I'm an extroverted person, and I really like working with other people and working with other people on projects. And for me, the easiest way to think about problems is to think about problems with other people in the room and a whiteboard. And so I think that's maybe my superpower, that I have a lot of social energy and like to think about problems and work with other people in a group, and that's maybe becoming more and more relevant as the problems we tackle are bigger and therefore need different expertise and need different people working on them at the same time. So yeah, I think that's my best answer to that question.
Well, no, that's very interesting because, I mean, I'm maybe a little biased, but a lot of researchers like to kind of focus on that one problem and really delve into it in solitude for hours, right? So you mentioning that is incredibly, I think, interesting and eye-opening. And also you're kind of in some ways giving AI empathy, or like, providing AI or just kind of channeling it towards social harmony in some ways, right? So you being a very social human being is definitely a plus there, I think. But yes, this has definitely been a very interesting conversation.
Thanks so much.
All right, well, thank you so much today.
Thank you.